So what we're going to talk about here is the thought process as you transition to a digital document from paper. How do you take a paper form and get it to an eMAR or eTAR? What goes where? Because there is a decision process that you go through to decide where to grab that documentation. If I'm looking at a form and trying to move it to the computer, what are our first decisions? So the first thing is absolutely looking at the data points and making sure they're what you want. So do they need to be asked differently? Do they need to be turned into a multiple choice? Or do they need to be a narrative box? And when you go from paper to electronic, you have an ability to create some decision pathways. So if you have a yes/no question, based off that yes/no question, you can ask more questions. So if they give a negative response to, like, say, did you take the COVID vaccine? Are you current? And if I say no, then the next question might be, what were the barriers to taking the vaccine? Were they just not available, sick at the time, whatever. Or if they say yes, then you may move on to something else. So, as far as which questions you might want to ask. So you get some new features. And probably the biggest thing there is you can make some things required. And that's another big decision point, is what questions have to be required. So, because if you make it required and they can't answer it, then they're stuck. They won't be able to finish out the document, where on paper you can just leave it blank. And it's multiple choice. You got to make sure that it covers all the potential outcomes, right? So generally on multiple choice questions, you may want to give them the ability to check a box that says other. Otherwise, you're going to get stuck into a place where they can't logically answer the question. Well, so let's say that one of the questions on your assessment, and this is something I would do as a nurse practitioner and ask, when did your parents pass away? And if you make that question be a year field, on a computer, they've got to put in a year. On a piece of paper, they could write in, late 2022, where if you say it's a date, they're going to pick a specific date. So those are the kind of questions you have to look at when you're designing your transfer to digital document. What else did we think about here, Dana? What do you think about?
I think that we want to look at what the purpose of the assessment is. What information are we trying to extract? What is the purpose? And so that way we can guide our digital assessment to allow us to extract that information out and gather data so that we can trend and track or monitor results from that.
Yeah, we can show a few things. So this will be the setup in the background that we're looking at. So this is the builder that we use to build our assessments, or that the customer can as well in our software. All right, I'm just going to call this one a test one because I'll delete it when I'm done. All right, so most builders will let you create the assessment, and they'll have places where you can define things like scoring and whether it's going to be a repeat, or that you have to enforce like a next due date. So there's all kinds of things and consideration that goes into that. You also have to look at your piece of paper. Generally, an assessment will have sections. And then this is where we get to create the sections on our thing. And the section, in my mind, is a group of logically related questions. So if I'm asking questions about cardiac, I may have a section for cardiac. If I'm asking questions about nutrition, I may have a section for nutrition. So most good builders will have a way where you can do that. And then inside of each of these sections, you'll have the things that you're going to ask. And so in our software, these are the choices we have: single, multiple choice, a yes, no. You can have, these are basically text fields that enter. You can do different things. Decision questions, which is I was talking about a while ago. If you have a clinical decision point where you want to collect more data versus not, you can use a decision question to guide that. Most electronic software has this ability, which is a big advantage over paper, is that you can pull in things already in the system. So on paper, when I would admit a patient, I might have to put their date of birth and their allergies. I might have to write that 20 times on 20 different pieces of paper. In a computer system, you don't. You put it in once and you can pull it forward into these other assessments depending on the software. And then ours also has the ability to add some graphics and things. So some of the choices here, the single, multiple choice, and the thing I was talking about is about making fields required. And I was also talking about multiple choice things where people can't get out of a logical question because you've made it required. So like in this, if I wanted to do an option here. What does patient, I'm just throwing something out there. There may be some question along these lines of, what's your morning beverage of choice or something. If I say this field is required and I go over here and I only put coffee, milk, water, when this person answers this question, what if the patient says orange juice? So you want to make sure that you give them a chance to do other responses. And by checking that little box, what happens is it adds another option on when it shows on the computer, and it'll give them a place to document. If your software doesn't have that ability, you can always type in other here. And then what I would do if it was other is I might give them a text box right below that to kind of free text stuff. And I might not make this text box required, so I have this ability to set it as required. I might not make this required. I just give them the option to do it, and maybe just give them 100 characters. And that's another thing, is you can kind of control the amount of things that they can do. The other advantage of going paper to digital is you have the ability to pull forward. This is another place you have to make a lot of decisions around. Is the data point you're pulling forward appropriate to pull forward? Because people are human and they might not catch that something pulled forward that's maybe not accurate anymore. So like I would never pull forward, say, a weight field or does the patient have any wounds kind of question. But I might pull forward, patient has an amputation, yes, no kind of question. Well, that amputation is not going to go away. That answer is always going to be yes. So I would pull forward that kind of question. Most software does allow the ability to add some graphic fields, which is nice. It allows you to document on fewer pages sometimes, although one of the trade-offs you're going to have to accept when you go from paper to electronic is paper forms don't have to have every contingency calculated in, because but with paper, you have the ability to kind of write in the margins, or if the field's only 20 characters on the computer, you've got 20 characters, but on a piece of paper, you can go past the box if you need to, or draw an arrow. You can't do those kind of things in the computer, so you have to consider, that too, is what are they doing on paper that this form's really not meeting the needs of? And the best way to explore that is actually look at maybe 30, 40 examples of those forms having been filled out and see where they're breaking what I would call the rules of the paper. They're not using the space allotted, or they're answering in a way that the question wasn't really intending for them to answer, because they can on paper. You have to remember when they go to the computer, they can't do that anymore. So.
I think another feature that's so cool about UDAs or digital assessments is that the information is put into the system and then it's immediately available to everyone on your team. And you can extract some pretty important details that other people might miss or might not see until later, like a history of falls or the psychotropic meds that they may be taking, or an abnormal blood pressure or low weight, swallowing difficulties, all kinds of data, and it can be dispersed to different disciplines at the same time. You can get an alert on your assignments immediately and know if there's something that's way off for baseline, or you can have it sent to your care plan decision making, so you can correlate it to your MDS. So there's just so many different ways that information can be used.
That's a good point. If there's a data point you do want to keep track of, like how many people have catheters, then you need to put that question in an assessment somewhere. And that way you can pull that to, like she's talking about, the different reporting features in your system. So there's some opportunities that you'll never have on paper here, which is the ability to trigger events and correlate data. You also have the ability to pull things from one assessment to another with most software. So if you look at your assessments, that all the assessments you're doing, you might find that you have 4 different people asking the same question. A good example is I've seen multiple places where they'll ask if the person has a nickname, and never fails, somebody answers it differently. So I would limit that to one place to ask that question. So like I might have the activity person ask about nicknames and just have that answer pull forward to the nursing assessment and the social services assessment, say, if you actually need that data point on those assessments.